So I want to explain this because it is new, but it's also kind of not new. And I think right now, particularly with this Count Majestic, who has really just kind of come onto the scene really strong and blown up a lot and is, doing all sorts of scoops and talking about the trailers and has become a name pretty quickly. But there's a lot of skepticism over what this person knows, how accurate they are, et cetera, et cetera. I want to explain sort of in thorough, my usual, like way too deep, way too nerdy way, what I think is going on here. But let's first speak to the report that basically just came out yesterday. You know what? I want to look at the version on over here because I think it's a little bit more succinct. Okay, but I will explain where this comes from before Majestic and what I think is going on here. Okay, He Who Remains created 616, a sacred and controlled timeline to hide the true history of the multiverse. Victor Von Doom was considered too dangerous, so He Who Remains rewrote him into the 616 timeline. The rewriting turned Doom into Tony Stark with the same mind altered and a new identity and life as a hero. Tony Stark always felt like he didn't fit in with his family because his real life had been stolen. Those feelings of not belonging are echoes of Doom's original identity trying to awaken. The time travel Tony used in Endgame was deliberately allowed by He Who Remains. He Who Remains permitted those time travels because he needed a variant of Loki to survive outside of his control. The survival of that Loki variant was part of He Who Remains' plan to prepare for future events. The main purpose of He Who Remains was not permanent peace, but to prepare for a multiversal war against the Kang variants who betrayed him. When Tony Stark dies, a key piece of He Who Remains' control disappears. We're going to come back to that. That's really interesting. With the death of He Who Remains, the barriers containing realities break, and all versions of Doom come back into existence. Among those versions, the Doom who fought and lost in the multiversal war regains his memory. Upon uncovering his memory, that Doom feels humiliated for having been turned into a puppet of He Who Remains. That humiliation becomes his driving force. Doom doesn't just want revenge. He wants to rebuild the multiverse his own way. Okay, so you might recall we went over this before. Maybe some of you do. I'll look at chat here in a second. Do you guys remember going over this before or not? This was out there around June of last year, which is actually going to become a really, really important time. And, I like to kind of keep track of how these things happen so that I can later revisit the validity of them. And another story we're going to talk about in a bit here, which is the Mephisto story, is also going to connect to that time period as well. So this is now being circulated again by Majestic. Now, what I think I know about this and why I think this is coming out again now is basically, I think all the scoopers, and this goes back to that Discord that people got into or were perhaps allowed into. Back in June of last year, I strongly feel as though they got a massive info dump from various sources, or maybe just one source, inside Marvel Studios. And I think from that massive info dump, a lot of that info then, it's not like the scoopers just tell you everything. They sort of keep it all, and then they sort of drip feed it out, right? Because they want, more engagement, more Patreon subscriptions or whatever, visits to a website. So they sort of drip that info out. But I think they usually get it in big bulk things. And that's just because that's my experience as well with sources. You usually get it in bulk. And then you're like, sometimes they're like, you can't talk about this for a while. You can't talk about this for a while. So maybe that's a little bit of it, but it's probably more just they're holding off to continue to make content. Well, the way I understand it is Majestic either got access or was given access to that Discord. And so to Majestic, all of this stuff is basically new. And so I think, I could be wrong about this, but my speculation is that like what is happening right now is Majestic and maybe some others are getting information that is potentially a year old or more that for them is like the first time they're hearing it. And so they're posting it all because to them it's new and it's fresh and whatever. And part of me actually thinks that the actual scoopers let these people in to throw other people off the scent to allow some of this information to get out there into the wild in different accounts. Like literally, I'm pretty sure that's what happened. Because I think even Majestic is still in contact with some of the scoopers that are in that Discord, and he's literally being given permission to say some of the stuff that he's saying. Okay? So, with all of that in mind, you must ask, well, what does that mean for it? Like, is this valid? Is this not valid? I mean, I feel as though it is valid, because although Majestic may not be getting new information, and although Majestic might not be getting, new sources, I think because all of those other scoopers were accurate the entire time and kind of knew what was going on, or at least had a bunch of info for a long, long time, I think that Majestic therefore is accurate because he's mostly paying attention to like super accurate people. That could obviously not be real. And I've told you before, some of these scoopers will, after they get a platform or a profile, start listening to too many voices and reporting too many things. And that's how they sort of get caught up. However, going back to this, right, and thinking through some of the more recent things that have been said from the scoopers, and I'm talking about within the last 3 to 4 months here, I'm starting to feel as though they knew about this like a long, long time ago. Okay? So let's go through it again with sort of the new leaks in mind, okay? So He Remains created the 616 or Sacred Timeline, controlled the timeline to hide the true history of the multiverse. I mean, we literally know that's true. We know that's true from the Loki show, through B-15's memories, through Ravonna Renslayer's memories, even through Victor Timely memories, and memories from, what's the guy's name that Hen-Yan played? He's a fun character. It wasn't Paradox, but I forget that character's name. But we know kind of that that's true, right? So there's a true history being hidden. And the sacred timeline, which is Earth 616, is controlled. Victor Von Doom was considered too dangerous, so He Remains rewrote him into the 616 timeline. Well, that's OB, thank you. So that actually sounds like stuff that Alex Perez has talked about, right? Alex has talked about how in the original version of how this was going to go, like when they thought Kang was going to work and before Majors got in trouble, the Kang Dynasty in Secret Wars was basically going to explain that Victor Von Doom was considered too dangerous. Maybe the X-Men were as well. And Alex even said that the X-Men and Doctor Doom might have well been the focus of the saga after Secret Wars and Kang Dynasty. So that totally makes sense. Victor Von Doom was considered too dangerous, so he rewrote him into the timeline. Rewriting turned Doctor Doom into Tony Stark with the same mind altered as a new identity and life as a hero. Now, this is really interesting because it kind of connects to some stuff that Alex said about Victor or the Fantastic Four in 838, which, by the way, I have a video coming out right now. I'm working on it. Gonna do some more editing on it tonight. I've been teasing to you guys about how there are other characters than Tony that are fake. And this is the video where I'm finally gonna let a little bit of that out. And I'll tease something to you right now. I think both Scott Lang and James Rhodes are not actually Scott Lang and James Rhodes. So watch the video. It'll either drop tonight or it'll drop tomorrow. But I think I know where they might be going with that. No, I mean 838. Let me explain. Maybe I'm getting lost in the sauce here, okay? In 838, when Stephen Strange meets the Fantastic Four and is introduced to the idea of the Fantastic Four, Stephen Strange says, weren't you guys a band, or didn't you chart in the 60s, referring to a band? And Alex literally said, that is because that Stephen Strange has a memory of the real universe that was altered. So instead of the actual memory that he had from the Prime universe, which included knowing the Fantastic Four as astronauts that went up in the 60s, got their cosmic rays and got the power, okay? So in the original version for Kang Dynasty, it was basically going to be revealed, and we know that, remember, Stephen Strange was always going to be a big part of this. There's always been something planned with Stephen Strange for Secret Wars, okay? And I think it's that Stephen is Prime Stephen. He is a real Stephen Strange. There's a lot of fake motherfuckers out there, but Stephen is a real one. And that is, I think, why he had the memories. That's going to come into play in a second here, because it says here, Tony Stark always felt like he didn't fit in with his family because his real life had been stolen. Now, again, this is kind of connecting to this idea of like, okay, these characters were written into the roles by He Remains, literally authoring the entire timeline. So is it possible that the memories of what were will never truly leave? And you know what's kind of interesting about that is it reminds me of the line that Thanos had at the end of Endgame. Okay, now the reason this is important, really just lean in and focus to this part, okay? The reason this is important is because it's very obvious now that the Doomsday movie and what was going to be Kang Dynasty is actually a sequel to Endgame more than anything. Loki was sort of a interlude between Endgame and what was once Kang Dynasty and what became Doomsday. That is like so obvious to me. If you've been paying attention to the rumors, that's what it is. But what's interesting about what Thanos says is he says to Tony, he says literally, I'm grateful you showed me this. Because I originally thought I could snap away half of the life and I would have a grateful universe. But what I realize now is people will never be able to let go of the memory of what was. So now I'm going to tear this universe apart atom by atom and remake a grateful one. Okay? So that idea was in the mind of Parliament, was in the mind of Kevin Feige, was in the mind of Michael Waldron, even all the way back to writing Loki season 1 and, you know, doing Endgame and all of that sort of stuff. Okay, so just think about how these things have been set up and are, because if you've studied Marvel as long as I have, you realize that one of the things Kevin's really brilliant at that he doesn't get a lot of credit for is getting the normies to accept high-level ideas. So Thor is a movie that without it working, we cannot do Doctor Strange. And Kevin has talked about this. He said, we had to make the magic work via Thor in order to dial that up for what was going to come in Doctor Strange and on and on and on. And so these ideas are sort of introduced into the audience. And like you can see, I have like multiple books where this is discussed and stuff like that. But just trust me, like this is something they do, okay? So let's keep going here. Those feelings of not belonging are echoes. Isn't it interesting that he uses the word echoes of Doom's original identity trying to awaken? The time travel Tony used in Endgame was deliberately allowed by He Who Remains. He Who Remains permitted those time travels because he needed a variant of Loki outside of his control. Now that's like a whole nother thing. I think you could get really lost in the sauce on that. But basically what he is saying is, remember in Loki season 2, where even after breaking the rules of time travel within the TVA and literally being able to travel anywhere in the multiverse and use causal time travel, basically he comes to odds with Kang again and realizes that even that was planned. All of that was a part of the plan. Loki is the other failsafe. He's the other failsafe, okay? The survival of that Loki variant was a part of He Who Remains' plan to prepare for future events. The main purpose of He Who Remains was not permanent peace, but to prepare for a multiversal war against the Kang variants who betrayed him. So that's always a part of the idea. I think all of that makes sense. When Tony Stark dies, a key piece of He Who Remains' control disappears. With the death of He Who Remains, the barriers containing realities break, and all versions of Doom come back into existence. Among those versions, the Doom who fought and lost the multiversal war regains his memory. Now, let's go back to this idea of echoes of memory. Let's go back to what Alex Press said about Stephen Strange and his memory of the Fantastic Four. So what this means is Tony Stark dying eliminates He Who Remains control. Now, let's stop for a second. What's weird about that? Does anybody have any questions, or perhaps is there something about that that's a little bit odd, maybe? Because there is. But what do you guys think? I know it's a Monday. We're just getting the juices going here. But what do you think about that? I don't see how Doom stays interesting after Secret Wars without RDJ with his backstory. Yeah, no, that's a fair point. Why is Kang? Well, so what's interesting about that is we know that the time heist was intentional. Or rather, permitted. And you would assume all the events of Endgame were therefore permitted. But think about it. Loki was pulled out of the timeline before the end of Endgame. Okay? So you got to think about this. It is possible the death of Tony Stark happens again after the Secret War. I know. Crazy, right? Okay, anyway, let's try to stay on target. So Tony Stark dies. A key piece of He Who Remains control disappears. With the death of He Who Remains, the barriers containing realities break, and all versions of Doom come back into existence. Among those versions, the Doom who fought and lost in the multiversal war regains his memories. Now, to me, this connects to a lot of the whole thing with Doom has a vendetta against the multiverse. It connects to this idea that might even be in the trailer where Doom is talking about this eternal prison. Remember, there's rumors and leaks that Victor's going to speak of an eternal prison that he must break out of. And I think it's this. And if Doctor Strange is going to support Doctor Doom, which that is the indications of all the rumors, that's what we think is going to happen. Why? Because they're both the prime variants of the character. They're both the real characters. Doesn't that make sense? So, among those versions, the Doom who fought and lost the multiversal war regains his memory. Now, we really don't know which variant of Doom this is. By the way, and I'm working on a big video on this, but it's actually kind of really heady and trippy, and it's taking a lot of script writing to sort of explain this simply. But I'll try to give you a little bit of a thing here on it, okay? Let's talk about Ralph Bohner. What happened with Ralph Bohner? What really happened with Ralph Bohner? I want you to think about this, okay? So, Agatha claims that she just grabbed up some random person and using her magic was able to give him the powers of the actual character. Okay. But if the multiverse, like let's just assume that Ralph Bohner is the prime variant. Okay. Is it possible that what really happened was sort of grabbing up something from, I don't know, an alternate dimension, maybe like the prime version of the universe, and sort of bringing it into our universe and placing it within maybe what you would call a sort of receptacle or the body of this being? I think there's something to the Ralph Bohner thing. And to be honest with you, I think there's something to Chris Evans being the Human Torch and being Steve Rogers. Okay? As we've sort of seen in Deadpool and Wolverine, although I don't know how much this was intentional, that version of Johnny actually is, to me, a little bit more like Steve than you would expect. And in fact, he's so much like Steve that Deadpool thinks he's Steve. And he kind of acts a little bit more heroic and serious than maybe you would expect Johnny to act. I think it's possible, and I'm not sure, but I think it's possible that Marvel's actually going to give us a really crazy explanation for what all of that actually is. And I do think it's possible that we're literally getting remixed characters from the Prime Universe. But, okay, so that's a little bit trippy. We're going way down on a rabbit hole on that. But anyway, think about this. The Doom that fought and lost in the multiversal war regains his memories. Upon recovering his memory, that Doom feels humiliated for having been turned into a puppet of He Who Remains. The humiliation, it becomes his driving force. Doom doesn't just want revenge. He wants to rebuild the multiverse his own way. This, to me, is still the best possible motivation for the RDJ thing. I know there's a lot of effort from the scoopers to tell you that it's about his family and it's about the destruction of the multiverse and all these other things, but it never felt right to me. If you understand the character of Victor, none of that shit makes any sense. The only thing that really makes sense is Doom being the Prime Universe version and him being rewritten into Tony, and he's going to regain his memory. He's going to realize what happened. He's going to be super fucking pissed. He might even then be willing to sacrifice his own family because he thinks that universe is fake as fuck anyways. And then he's willing to do anything to take over the multiverse, break that cycle, and end it. Because, yeah, you would be willing to do anything, right? You would be willing to do anything if you thought that. So what's really interesting about this is, again, Majestic has been saying a lot lately that my theory's right. I mean, I had a whole conversation with him about it. And I think it's because he has access to actual info now. And I think that this actual info is laying out pretty much the case for it. The one thing I can't figure out, though, is why are all the scoopers lying about this? Are they being lied to about this, or are they working for Disney? You know what I mean? Like, that's legitimately like what I don't understand. And, you know, maybe the Occam's razor explanation is Marvel has become more sophisticated in the way they're hiding their leaks. I've talked about this theory before, but, you know, I think they might have found a way to create stories that are so similar to what their actual plans are that the fake info then checks out with a lot of like internet detectives, and then they get spread around. So just wanted to kind of touch on this. I'm interested in what you guys think. What do you think of this? And also, and this is maybe a really important part of the question, do you think the trailer will start to put this to bed? Do you think the trailer, after we watch the trailer, do you think it's going to be basically obvious that, you know, my theory was correct and that this is what they're cooking? That is a really interesting element about it. I can finally chat again. I hate all of this. Ban him! Get him out of here! Welcome, and you're gone. Josh, if your theory does not turn out to be right, what are the odds that you will like the movie? Well, frankly, if my theory's not right, then it's basically just a version of him sacrificing. I think there's still a lot of ways it could go that would be cool. Because even if it's just like, okay, Franklin, and he sacrificed Franklin, or maybe Franklin and them all died, and he took all these powers or whatever, there's so much evidence that what's really happening here is a dark version of Doom that is hell-bent on destroying the multiverse no matter what. That's badass. So I can get down with that. But I'm going to be honest with you. I think this shit is real. I think it's giving everyone an excuse to make content that people are going to run with because everybody wants to know what's going on. Well, there's certainly truth in that. I mean, it's one of the most, I think, interesting things going on in fandom in general. So there's obviously a lot of interest there. I mean, the RDJ thing is crazy. He was the most famous. This is why it's so wild. He was the most famous actor playing the most famous character. Like, seriously, we've talked about this before, but you look at some of the statistics of Marvel, it was blowing up as social media was so prevalent that the only thing that really compares to just overall impressions over the last 15 years is like Minecraft. You're talking about billions and billions of impressions and views. So many people know not only about Marvel, but more specifically about RDJ as Tony Stark, that when you bring him back as a different character, it is inherently interesting. What you have to ask yourself is it just an inherently interesting thing? And did they do it just because it's inherently interesting? Or is there something more going on? And I think that the odds are there's something more going on. Does that make sense? Do half the casuals even know who He Who Remains is? A lot of people will watch Doomsday who wouldn't have watched post Spider-Man. I think that's a fair point, and I would say that in some ways connecting it to Endgame solves that problem. Because, you know, look, Deadpool and Wolverine was huge. By the way, did you see how much money that thing cost? That's so stupid, bro. What are we doing? What are we doing? $500 million on this fucking thing? What are we doing? But Deadpool Wolverine was big, and that involved the TVA and shit like that. I think people at least are aware of the multiverse and the TVA. So TVA, multiverse, Loki, Endgame, those are like your thick branches, you know what I mean? And everything else is sort of peripheral. True, there's probably leaking fake news. No one seems to want to put their reputation on the line and say for certain who Sadie Sink is and the villain of Brand New Day is. Yeah. I mean, do you have a theory on the colors of the titles, Doomsday green and Secret Wars Iron Man colors? Yeah. So, look, I'll tell you what I think it is. So, Kang Dynasty was originally just, you know, going to be Kang, and then there was going to be God Emperor Doom, I strongly feel, in Secret Wars. Secret Wars was originally white. Because I think originally they were going to bring RDJ back as God Emperor Doom wearing white in Secret Wars. And then he was really going to be the villain of the X-Men saga. Okay, that's like some stuff Perez said and, you know, some speculation. But I think when they changed it to Doomsday and Secret Wars with the Russos, the color choices were also intentional. Doomsday is green for Doom. The Iron Man or the Secret Wars logo is orange and red for Tony Stark. And I feel like, yes, that's what they were doing. 1.5 is a lock if the movie's well received with Jackman. Yes, no, I 100% agree with that. Yeah. It kind of changes Doctor Strange's quivering finger one at the climax of Endgame. Maybe he was actually nervous because he realized they live now only to have Doom instigated cataclysm to come. There is some evidence that Steven knew more than he let on. Yes. And that will be a fascinating thing because here's the thing. What maybe you're missing at that question, that's a great question, but maybe the thing you're missing is, what version of Steven are you talking about? Because we have potentially a version that had his memories altered, and then we have the Prime version. And as far as we understand it, even all the way into Multiverse of Madness, that's still not Prime Steven because he doesn't remember the Fantastic Four. So at what point did Steven, when he opened the Darkhold maybe, when he opened up his third eye, when did Steven know what was going on? Why was he so willing to go with Clea? I mean, there's a lot there, right? So Steven knew, but were those memories hidden? How do we get out of Secret Wars and back to Endgame fight with Tony snapping if after Secret Wars we go back to the Prime 616 where RDJ isn't Tony? Because what's going to happen is, in my opinion, I don't know for sure, okay? But what's going to happen is Tony Stark still did the snap. Okay? Tony Stark still did the snap, and he did it before the second Secret War. But what's going to happen after the reset is you essentially will just get that story, and then maybe, oh my God, miraculously, Tony Stark actually is alive, and then he's a different actor. Does that make sense? But that's a trick. That's a good question, but I think there's a way out of all of this. Time is a loop, right? So the end game will come back into the fold. Yeah, so I kind of teased this last week, but I'm pretty sure it'll be like either Agents of Axis or Agents of Asgard version of Loki, where he becomes God of Stories. And he sort of grabs up and crystallizes or codifies these moments in time. Big ones from Marvel's past, like the Kree-Skrull War, Civil War, Avengers vs. X-Men, etc. And then when the new timeline is reset, he just places those back into the timeline. Now, what I think would happen is, because let's just say, because we're going to talk about Tom Cruise Iron Man a little bit today. Let's just say, for instance, Marvel has this big secret plan to make Tom Cruise Iron Man after Secret Wars. Okay? So what that would mean is at some point, either during Secret Wars or after it, we would get a scene, a montage, or maybe some flashbacks to scenes we had already seen with RDJ, but they would be, I don't know, face swapped or just reshot, use some movie magic to have it actually be Iron Man or Cruise. And then it would be either, okay, the snap didn't kill Tony, so the timeline's a little bit altered because maybe Tony didn't die, or Tony's miraculously back. And everybody just recognizes him as actual Tony. You know what I mean? So I'm not saying that's going to happen, but I'm saying, like, I would do that. I would do that in a heartbeat. Because maybe what our DJ Iron Man really cares about is his family. Do you know what I'm saying? I think Ryan Gosling's already our new Tony Stark. Yeah, I don't know about that, but I do hope our new Tony Stark is, like, I want to go back to the older Tony Stark energy. I want him to be a playboy. I want him to have swagger. I want him to be quippy and rude and smart. Yeah, I think there's a way that our next Iron Man is incredible, and we really I would say we really need to get back to that Hugh Hefner energy. That kind of energy with Iron Man. And if they do that, I think a lot of people will embrace it. Yeah, mullet, porn stash, lots of alcohol. That's the Tony we need. That's the Tony we need.